I'm Peter Snell. I've lived in Facet Square now for about 25 years. It may be familiar to a lot of you because when they were building the set for EastEnders they needed a model for an old Victorian house, and so they took plaster casts at the front of the houses and that was used to make the set. These few houses here typify the recent history. They were derelict, they were then transferred to a housing association, and they ripped out anything that was Victorian, including the slates on the roof, to thoroughly modernise the houses in, I guess, 80s terms. Since then, the area has been designated a conservation area, and this square is at the heart of that conservation area. So nowadays, they wouldn't be allowed to make those changes. They would have to keep the slates on the roof, and they would have to keep the sash windows. To be honest, the standard of what they did was far higher than what many owner-occupiers were doing at the time, and if it wasn't for these small family houses here, we'd probably have virtually no East End families left living in the square. Next to the square is the 30s block of the German hospital. It's now a listed building. The reason it was listed is because it was the first use in this country of some fairly revolutionary building ideas, particularly around pediment balconies and the use of composite bricks. The square gardens are now entirely managed by residents of the square. These trees have been here since 1860. They're lime trees, and the reason they're still there is every year we cut them right back to the centre so they grow out again. So, in London, generally biofuel is not regarded as a good source of renewable energy because you use petrol to bring the wood to London. But in this case, we can look at trimming the trees and using the trimmings from the trees as a biofuel. Quite how many houses we could heat, I'm not sure. This is my house. Sadly, I've never got round to redecorating the outside, but I have done a few different things along the way. Up at the top, I've put the chimney back on, so I can use the fireplaces at the front of the house. On the roof, I've replaced the old Victorian slates, which were starting to slip, with Spanish slates. As a house, to retrofit, it does pose extra problems. Mid-terrace, you don't have many external walls, so therefore it's quite simple to insulate just the few walls. Because mine is the end of the terrace, it has a flank wall, which means there's far more surface area from which the house is going to lose heat. When I first moved here about 25 years ago, a number of us did appreciate the Victorian homes, and bit by bit we tried to bring back some of the features that had been lost. So the first thing I did was go across to the houses across the road, which the Housing Association was just taking over, and I collected the double doors so I could put these two downstairs rooms separate again. So they can open up into one room when we need it, but most of the time they stay as two separate rooms. The next thing I did was notice that some builders just round the corner on Graham Road were refurbishing a house there, and they took out this beautiful slate fireplace, which I think I bought off them for £25, but there is another one upstairs, so I might have got them both for £25. I'm actually quite a fan of old Victorian plaster because it does suck up a lot of the noise. In terms of the ceiling, in the front downstairs rooms, we've got the original lathe and plaster, while in the back, when we looked at it, we found it had plasterboard, and when they put the plasterboard ceiling in, they ripped out all the old cornicing and the central ceiling rose. There is quite a bit of competition in the square for who's got the nicest cornices. In this house, there's a really good one, probably the second best in the square, down in the front room. And one of the things that holds people back from insulating walls is a fear that they're going to lose the cornice. What we're ending up doing here is keeping the original cornice in the front room. The back room had lost its cornice, so we're not worried too much there about running the insulation right up to the ceiling, and we will simply reinstall a fancy cornice of the type that matches the one that's in the front room. It's always good in an old house to be able to sit round a fireplace, but of course when I moved in, all the fireplaces were blocked up. So when you took out the blocks that were in the way, often the arch would fall down and you had to rebuild the arch. The point is, over time, I've rebuilt the chimneys at the front fireplaces, but at the back fireplaces, the chimney doesn't actually go past the first floor. But it does give me the chance to put in a biofuel boiler with a back boiler so the hot water can be transferred into the rest of the system, and then just run up a modern chimney above the first floor. In all these houses in the square, there's a cellar which runs underneath the entrance porch and back into the kitchen, and then under the living rooms there's about that depth down to earth with joists above. So in advance of the works you can look at the cellar, you can get an idea for how thick the timbers are, and I'd realised that in fact these timbers, 3-inch thickness, were really inadequate as joists by modern standards. What we hoped was that that was just going to be in the cellar, and that when we lifted to the main floor we'd find that actually the timbers were thicker there. But in fact these little 3x2 timbers run all the way through the house, and they're completely inadequate because if you jump up and down the floor moves like crazy, and in some areas you can see where it's sunk and failed. This is a particularly bad example. What we have here is 2 timbers just nailed together in the middle of an extended run. No way that is an adequate way to support the floor. And other places here, very, very thin little timber, about 1 inch wide, supported on a very narrow post that actually is attached onto the stairs down into the cellar. So once you do lift the floor, you've got a golden opportunity to look at what's wrong with it and put it right for good. But you need a good carpenter to help you do it. I'd had the builder in. He'd put a toilet onto every floor, a bathroom on every floor, and I needed to get the house fit for use again. And I went for what seemed like the easy and the trendy option, which is you just go through, sand the floors and put varnish on top of them. Virtually every house in the square has done it. And what we all then find is that the house costs a fortune to heat. Problem is that these are old Victorian timbers. There's no tongues and grooves on them, there's big gaps between them. Underneath you've got the air circulating in the cellar as it should do, and it makes the house completely non-airtight, which means that all the heat just goes straight out through the floor. So this time around, having got a new mortgage to retrofit the house properly, I decided that if I was going to rip all the plaster off the walls, which makes a real mess, then I might as well lift the floorboards and do the job properly.
If you are contemplating underfloor heating of this system, strongly advise you to obviously get a competent electrician in. What you'll probably find is if you have your electrics tested, although they may be intrinsically safe, they will not necessarily be compliant with the latest regulations, and you know, it might be a good time then to just upgrade your system, have it all checked, make sure it's all fine. We've got a box here, it's not that old, but again it's not compliant with the current regulations, so we'll be replacing this at the same time. In effect now pretty much everything has to be RCD protected. It's a residual current device, and it's a backup shock protection system in conjunction with your earthing system. And also the electrician then can just make sure that you're where you're putting the insulation down, that he can pull the wires out as much as you can. We're pulling these out, we're putting them in trunking below the ceiling to keep them well away from the insulation. And where you can't do that, keep the wires, you know, in contact with a joist or a ceiling, just so the heat's got somewhere to go, and that'll avoid damaging your cables. You know, the last thing you want to be doing is taking up your underfloor heating, you know, 2 years later with an electrical fault that you could have addressed at this time.
I and a lot of the new residents in the square are now putting back in the Victorian features that were ripped out in the 60s and 70s by people who thought Victorian just wasn't cool. Now, one of the things that they'd done in this house was to rip out all the old sash windows and put in very poorly fitting double glazed windows. So slowly, one by one, I'm going through replacing them with sash windows. In fact, this will be the first house in the square, I think, that has sash windows to current building regulation standards. Now it costs a fortune for each of those windows, so I'm very pleased they do claim that sash windows actually put so much value on the house that they pay for themselves. I'm not going to be selling, so I'm not going to find out.